Welcome to the Highland Wonders Podcast, where we share stories and knowledge from experts about the charismatic species and diverse ecosystems of the Okanogan Highlands of north central Washington. My name is Jen Weddle, and I am one of the co-directors of Okanogan Highlands Alliance, a nonprofit conservation organization dedicated to protecting the beautiful Okanogan Highlands. We are so excited to be back with Season 2 of the Highland Wonders Podcast. And I thought I'd start us off with a question. What do you think of when someone says, web of life? Plants? Animals? Sure, yeah, okay. These are really cool entire kingdoms of their own. But there are more kingdoms. 3 to 5 more kingdoms, depending on how you like to organize your earthly life forms. And representatives of the kingdom that we are exploring today are everywhere. In the soil, the air, the forest, the water, even your food, and on your skin. Some are just enormous, the biggest life forms on Earth, and some are too small to be seen without a microscope. But even when you can't see them, sometimes you can tell they're there because you can feel them. Sometimes you can smell them. Our world would not be what it is without the fungi kingdom. So what better topic to kick off Season 2 but fungi? The following talk with Helen Lau, Forest Service botanist, features the wild mushrooms of the Okanogan Highlands and is jam-packed with fungi facts. So enjoy! All that you are about to hear was originally presented in OHA's Highland Wonders Speaker Series and has been modified for this format.
My name is Helen Lau. So a little bit about myself. I'm a Forest Service botanist at the Cle Elum Ranger District, so I live in Cle Elum. My husband's from Okanogan, actually, so we have some ties to the area. I have an undergraduate degree from Evergreen State College. I studied forest ecology there, and that's what kickstarted my interest in fungi and ecology in general. And then I worked for the Forest Service for many years, and I continued on and got my master's degree at Central Washington University in beneficial fungi on pine trees. So a tree that you know well in the area. So today, I'm going to give you an introduction to mushrooms, and I never really know how much people know about them. Some people know nothing, and they're interested, and some people know a lot. So hopefully there's something interesting for all of you. And then I hope to talk a little about fungi ecology. I'll probably do more fungi ecology in this first part, and then we'll talk a little bit more about identification. I'm going to start out with a little introduction on fungi, a little bit about the morphological descriptions, sort of the characters of fungus, various ecological and human functions. Mycorrhizae, because the fungi that I studied for my master's was mycorrhizae, so that's something dear to me. Human uses, general identification. People are often interested in what are the fungi growing in their lawns. We interact with fungi more than in the forest, so it's good to just kind of see a little bit of that. Discuss a little about dangers, collection etiquette, and rare fungi, something that, as in plants and wildlife, we're also interested with fungi. One really interesting thing about fungi that a lot of people are not aware of is how they're related to us. Fungi tends to occur in relation to botany. It's almost always in a botany program, so we just inherently think fungi are related to plants. And actually, if you look at the evolutionary history, animals and fungi have a basal ancestor. So they both are derived from a single-celled prokaryote that had a tail. So it sort of looked a little like fungi, but a little bit like animal. Like sperm have that swimming tail. So originally, fungi were found in the water. They were aquatic fungi. And then through time, there were some individuals that lost that ability to swim, and they began to colonize land. So you'll see some fossil records of them showing up in the Devonian and associated with mosses. And so there's been some theories that fungi actually might have helped facilitate plants' arrival onto land because they're almost 90% of plants are sort of associated with fungi in some respect. So there are two groups, the ascomycete and the basidiomycete. And the ascomycota is like your cup fungi, your morels, that kind of group. And I'm going to talk a little bit about them today. And then the basidiomycota is your really traditional gills, your Alice in Wonderland fungi. And they fall into that group, among other fungi as well. Sometimes the terminology of what a fungus is can be a little confusing. A fungus itself is actually, well, there's different forms. So there's the spore, and the spore can be a resting stage. So through dry periods or fires, different kinds of impacts, cold, the spores can just rest in the soil and then just survive through time. And then when the environmental conditions are right, your spore will germinate and it'll form these thin, clear threads called hyphae, and that's actually the fungus. The fungus itself is just this spore and hyphal threads, and the hyphae is feeding, and that growth form tends to be sort of radial in circles because they're out feeding, searching for food. The fungi are kind of interesting. They're not like animals. They're not just male and female. They're mating types. And so you'll have one spore germinate, and it'll grow through the soil, and then you'll have another spore germinating, growing through the soil. And if they're different enough mating types, they'll fuse, and then they'll join together and become a mixed mating type. They actually form a little clamp, which you can see under the microscope. So we'll look for that. Sometimes we'll call it a clamp connection. And then they'll grow together. Each of these little cells actually has a little bit of genetic material from each parent. And so they're basically ready to go anytime there's the right environmental conditions, be it moisture, springtime, or a negative environmental condition, maybe fire, something that stimulates the growth. They'll set up a fruit. So they'll set up a mushroom. So the mushroom is actually just like an apple on a tree. It's a fruit. So it's not really the fungus itself. You're just seeing one of its fruits when you see a mushroom. Most people are really, the first thing you notice about fungi are just the large macro structures in the soil or the mushrooms popping up. So I'm probably going to be talking more about macrofungi. That's actually a very small percentage of fungi in the world. There's fungi that are on your skin and on plant surfaces and yeasts in your bread, but I'm probably going to speak mostly about what we say is macrofungi, so the large mega fungi. That's the megafauna of fungi. The major components of a fungus, so your real traditional fungus with the gills, are gills, what we say on the underside, a cap, and stem, and we might describe some things that are along the stem, what's at the base, and what's important sometimes is to realize that when you see a mushroom, you're just looking at one moment in time. They'll originate from these hyphal threads, and then eventually, as they fuse and the environment is right, they'll begin growing this massive tissue. So the whole inside of the mushroom body is full of just the hyphal threads. You can see that under the microscope. And we might be interested in the shape of the cap. We might also be interested in how the gills are attached to the cap. So these are just some things we think about when we're identifying some fungi. And there's a variety of the way fungi do this. So yeah, as I said, there's generally a stalk and a cap, and then it has a really nice umbrella shape, and that's really beneficial to their spore dispersal. So the spores in a gilled fungi are generally on the gills themselves, and they're underneath this umbrella. And so when it's moist enough, then you get a lot of humidity building up underneath the mushroom cap. And water droplets that form underneath these mushroom caps actually help push on the spores, and the spores are rocked loose, and so it's actually considered a forcible discharge. So it's really, that whole shape is really lending to that dynamic of getting those spores up. And the other interesting thing about fungi is just like plants, they're phototropic, so they can actually bend and grow towards the light. And that's an advantage to when it's moist enough and there's an open column in the forest, they'll actually be able to release their spores. The spores will go up into the air column, and they'll travel further out of the forest. So that's one way of doing it. And so these spores are born on the outside of the fungus. And so the other group, the Ascomycotas, the spores are born on the inside of a kind of tube called an asci. And that tends to be your morels. And it's just a different structure, different way of doing it. Those ascomycetes also make up things like yeasts and molds. So these are also within those groups. And molds and yeasts are a little different because those are actual asexual forms. So they are a form of fungus, and there's no sex going on with that. They're just reproducing themselves and cloning themselves and getting the same genetic material out. So within the fungi kingdom, there is a lot of diversity. I mean, just within these groups. So, within the two groups I mentioned, there's so many forms beyond just that normal guild form. Different colors, different shapes. There's just different ways to do it. And they seem to all have special niches. They all specialize in they have different functions, they have different predators or, different ways of being consumed. For instance, spores, I talked about this kind of like forcible discharge underneath a cap. Another way to do it is if the spores are contained inside of a sac, when the sac dries out, wildlife walk by, they will step on them. So those are puffballs. So that's one way to release spores into the air column. Another way, as you've learned a little bit about, is truffles, having wildlife help spread the spores. Another form of spore dispersal is autolyasing, which a fungi can actually completely melt itself and just become a pool of spores. And that has some advantages to it. So there's a lot of different shapes and colors and diversity within the kingdom. So as I said, fungi is its own kingdom. It's kind of a daunting kingdom sometimes when you get into identification because it's an entire kingdom. And within the kingdom, there are lots of different families and lots of genera, different genuses, and tons of species. The naming convention of fungi is very unorganized right now. Historically, we thought a lot of things were related to each other that are not, and now genetics is sort of switching everything around, and groups are spread out and brought together and taken apart, and so that's become very complicated. So in some ways, in ecology, we kind of try to simplify them, and we know that they have different ecological functions. And so like some of these groups, we know that we can classify by food source. They're saprophytic, so they just live on dead tissue. They get all of their mineral nutrition through consuming dead material. Wood, can even be bones, insects, chitin, cellulose, so a variety of things. They could be parasites, so they can actually kill a tree. They can kill living things to get their mineral nutrition. Parasitic, usually it means only they're benefiting, and then that organism is not benefiting. Symbiont, so sometimes they live together with other plants, sharing, and so it's a benefit to both organisms. So that's also another feeding lifestyle. And then there's facultative. And facultative is they're living just peacefully with another organism, sort of benefiting, but not really impacting. And then maybe suddenly, for instance, it's a plant, and the plant is stressed by wind or cold, they'll take advantage and then they'll just consume the plant. So that sort of can switch based on what the needs are at the moment, I guess. Some characters of fungi, they do not do any photosynthesis themselves, so they have to get their sugars some other way, unlike plants. They do a lot of their digestion outside of their body. So we have all of our digestive enzymes inside. They actually release digestive enzymes as they're going through the soil, and that is breaking down nutrients, and then they're absorbing what they can, and then they're leaving a lot of extra things broken down in the soil for all the other organisms. And so actually around the end of the hyphae tips, you'll see a whole suite of different organisms because this is like a really food nutrient site. So often when I talk to people about fungi, they instantly think of them as kind of not negative, but think they're causing all of this death in the forest, really killing sections of the forest, or they see dead trees, or we see fungi growing on live trees and we think it's killing that tree. But it can also be sort of a balance. I think they've it's sort of a check and balance in the forest. We have to have predators to balance the preys. And, fungi kind of also have that role. One of the most important jobs I think fungi have, though, is that they are amazing decomposers. They are one of the only organisms that can break down lignin. Paper mills, in order to get wood into paper, they have to use these really, really toxic chemicals to break down the hemicellulose. That's like the really hard cellulose within wood. Like if you ever see wood decomposing and you kick it, and sometimes it'll break off in blocks, and that's because the cellulose itself, there's cellulose running laterally down the wood, and then there's this hemicellulose running the crossways, and it's like a very, very hardy, solid cellulose that maintains that matrix, that hard structure. And fungi is pretty much the only organism that can break that down. So they're crucial in that initial decomposition process. I mean, if you could isolate that enzyme, you probably would make a lot of money and sell it to the paper mills. And so they also are found in the decomposition process, not just there in the beginning, but all the way through. One species will come in and decompose, the initial. They might come in just for the outer, easy to decompose sections of wood or plants, and then you'll have another species come in and another species. And so there's a whole succession of decomposition within all of the fungi. It might be multiple fungi species. And so that decomposition then is really important for nutrients in the soil, for bacteria. And so the bacteria and fungi kind of work in concert together, breaking down that ammonium and then breaking into smaller nitrogen components, nitrates, and then a lot of that will go back in and feed plants. And some of it goes into the atmosphere. And so they're just really connected to this whole nitrogen cycle. And nitrogen is a pretty limited nutrient in forest soils typically. So they're probably one of the main producers of this besides bacteria. But again, they work together. Another important function they have is food for the mammals themselves. Primarily it's squirrels and squirrels and chipmunks, I believe. Yeah, like 75 to 80% of their diets they have found have been fungi. I'm sure there are a lot of other mammals, like there are records of animals eating different fungi, but specifically squirrels and chipmunks. It's a very large part of their diet. And fungi are high in protein and also vitamin B. So it's a great protein source for them. They're also, as you've cooked with them before, they're great in soups. They just absorb. They're very absorptive. And so they're about 70 to 80% water. And so this might be another water source for small mammals. So I was going to talk about bioaccumulation. That's been something recent that people have been working with fungi in that recent oil spill that occurred in Florida. I think some of the cleanup efforts were using fungi. And so it's been kind of, more recently, people are looking at it to use it for bioremediation. Since they are so good at absorbing, and then they do all these metabolizing of nutrients, they can break down oil and petroleum. I think they've been using it in some different mines and definitely sort of metal disturbances. And then my favorite fungi function is mycorrhizae. So this would be the symbiotic groups that I was discussing earlier. So what is a mycorrhizae? A mycorrhizae is basically a symbiotic relationship between a fungus and plant. At the feeder roots of a plant, the fungus and the plant actually unravel themselves around each other, and they're just coexisting in this totally new structure. If you look under the microscope, they look like little fingers. And at that point, the fungi that are exploring the soil, that are collecting phosphorus, nitrogen, water, there's a whole bunch of different nutrients, they're actually sharing it with plants. And plants are doing all the photosynthesis for them and sharing their sugars back with them. About 90% of land plants are interacting in these kind of interactions with fungi. And there is some thought, too, that fungi really help plants in these dry periods. Those little thin threads are able to grow through the soil matrix, and where there's pockets of water, they can actually absorb that water, where a lot of plant roots won't be able to. And so they can share that water with the plants. This is kind of an interesting relationship. So on a single tree, you could have one individual forming this mycorrhizal relationship, and then you could actually have that same individual attached to another tree or another species of plant. And on a single tree, like in my study, I studied pines, they have found up to 25 different species on one tree. And so each of those species of fungi might specialize in making these mycorrhizal connections with different plants. So you can think of it, in the soil, there's essentially the fungi are kind of forming this nutrient superhighway between all of the plants. We tend to think of them all being sort of individual, but really there's a lot of sharing going on. And we kind of know things like, for instance, in your environment, you have a lot of regular fire intervals, and kinnikinnick is something that you'll find in these high fire interval forests. Well, they form mycorrhizae, and so they think that since kinnikinnick, they can keep these really deep roots, and they are able to retain some of that mycorrhizae. That's really crucial for then post-pine colonization of a mycorrhizal community. So maybe that would speak to, too, like not having really, really hot fires, probably very, very hot, high-intensity fires, you might kill a lot of these organisms. But if you have some of those refuges, these are really important source pools for future mycorrhizal colonization for plants. So not only in the soil itself, there's all these different food webs that fungi interact in, also in the terrestrial landscape. We know about squirrels. We talked about squirrels and chipmunks. About 80% of their diet is fungi. Flying squirrels specifically feed on truffles. And truffles are fungi that grow underground. They are not seen unless you are digging around in the soil. And when they're mature, they will release an odor. And so the flying squirrels or squirrels are able to locate them through their odor. A lot of truffles are fungi that are mycorrhizal. So some fungi are almost all mycorrhizal. They're getting all their sugar from plants. Some fungi are doing both. They might mostly consume just dead material, and then sometimes decide they'll make some connections with trees and get some sugar from them. But in the case of truffles, they are almost 100% getting their sugars from trees. And that connection, a mycorrhizal connection, is not something that can just occur in a very young stand. So you really need an older forest for this to establish, especially for the diversity. There are some truffle species that occur in sort of early successional forests, but to have the diversity as a food source, you really need an older forest. So we have this connection between a food source for flying squirrels. Well, flying squirrels are one of the primary food source of spotted owls. And so spotted owls also, in turn, then need this old growth structure. And I think also for other reasons, probably for nesting and different things like that. And so, there are just these interconnected terrestrial food webs as well as the ones underground. We need, if we want wine and beer, we definitely have to have fungi. Yeast, as I spoke about earlier, are your asexual form of fungi, and those are used in all of your bread making process, your beer making process, soy sauce, molds and cheese, fermenting miso. There's all kinds of food sources that are the basis of their production is fungi. And then, of course, just our normal consumption of mushrooms in our daily meals that you can find at the grocery store, shiitakes. I'm starting to see even wild mushrooms being farmed like chanterelles and things like that are just showing up in the regular grocery stores too. And then another function that a lot of people aren't aware of, but B complex, like a lot of the B vitamins are actually farmed from yeasts because you can just grow them so rapidly. So you can just extract the B vitamins right out of the yeast. And so they're usually what's behind those products. And then, of course, Chinese medicine has been using fungi for many years for medicines. And in Western medicine, penicillin is a mold. And so, there are many fungi derivative kind of pharmaceuticals as well. So they've benefited that way. So I was just going to talk briefly a little bit about toxicity. Often I get questions a lot at my office from people that have fungi in their lawns and they have dogs and their kids have touched them, and is that okay? And there are toxic fungi out there, for sure. However, if you touch one, you will be fine. A lot of mycologists, actually, for identification purposes, will chew a little bite of it and find out if it's spicy or sweet, or there's a lot of identification that you can be sensitive to in your mouth, and so we'll just chew it and then we spit it out, and that's perfectly okay. Most of the time people are not dying from fungi themselves. It's that the fungi, they're absorbing everything in their environment, and so they can produce metabolites that then cause liver complications or can cause some neurological complications, and those complications are the things that actually cause death. But the caveat I would share is that, fungi, that absorptive ability and those huge hyphal systems, if you see a mushroom, really you don't know where the fungus itself is located. So I would caution you to, if you're collecting mushrooms, to think about where you're collecting them. What's around there? What could it be absorbing? Because they're absorbing everything in the environment, and then they're metabolizing that, and likely they're breaking it down. But there is some element to the environment that you're consuming there. So something to consider. So if you are really interested in fungi, I think something to pay attention to is the habitat they're into. They have just a variety of habitats and lifestyles that are really special to them. For instance, Clatocybe glacialis specializes on glacialis. It likes snow melt, and so you always find it on the very edge of snow melt. Some specialize on cones. Strobularius trustellatus, always on a cone. You know it immediately. Dougford cone. It's got this kind of yellowish stem. That's what that is. And then there are some fungi that specialize on insects. And this group tends to be the cordyceps. And actually, cordyceps, some people, I think in Chinese medicine, they have been eating cordyceps. There's some idea that it has some increased metabolism properties. But the fungi-insect interaction is really interesting, because what will happen is that there's a little bit of brain manipulation going on. The fungi are, I think, consumed. The spores can land on the insect, and it will invade its body, and eventually it seems to make its way to its brain and actually somehow manipulates the brain of these insects, and the insects will crawl to a very high spot and then die at that high spot. So that allows the fungi to be as high as possible for when it produces its mushroom and to release its spore. So I don't know. There's some psychology, something's going on there. I don't know. It's pretty wild evolution there. And then I wanted to go into some of the fungi you might just see on your lawn. Somebody was just talking to me about Calvacia. It's a really common giant puffball that's often seen in lawns, yards, parks. There are very small puffballs that you might see around, especially in your trails. The Calvacia buniana tends to be one I feel like is more associated with the lawn. This is an edible. Another edible is your Agaricus campestris, the meadow mushroom, and they can be very large. The gills will be pink when they start, and the spores are actually brown, so then when it's mature, the gills turn brown or black. And the button mushrooms that you buy at the grocery store are evolved from there. I'll talk a little bit about how you should consume them. You do not want to just pop mushrooms in your mouth in the forest. My own rule of thumb. If I have to spend a lot of time under the microscope to identify it, I'm probably not going to eat it. Other people are, more daring, and there are ways you can tell them apart if you become really interested. The fairy ring mushrooms, that's, those kind of orange mushrooms you'll see growing in a circle, and like how the spores and their hyphae grow radially when they're feeding, and so all you're getting is the mushrooms at the tips of that radial growth. And individual fungi can be as large as just a square foot, but they have also found some of these parasitic fungi to be as large as football fields. So they can be really huge organisms. That's when I've heard people called dog barf. It looks like something like a dog barfed on your lawn. And really, this is a slime mold. And slime molds have been grouped in with fungi, but really slime mold are completely different. They're not even a fungus, but they're similar to fungus. So slime molds are kind of interesting. They are social organisms, like bees and ants. They're single-celled organisms that can move, so they kind of have flagella. They kind of form this amoeboid stage, and they're just seeking out carbohydrates, bacteria, dead things, and they'll just move around finding carbohydrates. And you can actually take one and have it as a pet. It's a great classroom pet, if any teachers are here. And you make a moat. So you can put a wet towel, you put the slime mold on top, and then you have water around it, and then you can just feed it oatmeal, and the slime mold will move around and eat it. You can see it move, which is over a couple days, which is really fun. But then they're a social organism, because what happens is when it's drying out or whatever condition it is that they don't like anymore, they'll start to separate, and multiple cells will come together and make stalks that look like fungi. And so an individual stalk will be made up of lots of different individuals to cooperate for the body, for the whole mass. So that's why I say they're a social organism. So they're kind of interesting. Anyway, a lot of people want to get rid of these out of their lawns. I really don't know what to tell you about them, but I guess you could just move them. Yeah, make a trail of oatmeal. Send them somewhere else. Anyway, there are some fungi that have been known to be toxic, and one people call the lawnmower's mushroom. I guess because when you mow your lawn, they're often there. And you can actually go on the web, if you're really concerned, you can go on the web and you can look up lawn fungi, poisonous lawn fungi, and see some of these. And then the death cap, Amanita phyloides. And there's a lot of amanitas. That's the storybook, the fairy tale Alice in the Wonderland, red mushroom is an amanita. And many of these amanitas produce a lot of different metabolites that are toxic. There are a few that are edible, and the edible ones are white. So that's why I think people are poisoned often by this one, because they're similar, and I don't know, people just like to be daring with that one. But it's called the death cap, so good reason you should stay away. So I would say if you are really interested in eating mushrooms, wild mushrooms, some good edibles, good safe ones are your shaggy manes. This group, Coprinus, they're the group of fungi that I talked about that do the autolysis with their spores. They just melt into this pool of blackness. If you guys know this mushroom, if you collect this and you don't cook it right away, it just becomes this massive pool of black nothing in your box. So collect that and cook it right away. Bread it and fry it. Morels. Morels are pretty easy once you become familiar with them. Those meadow mushrooms I was talking about, you could eat for a year with all of those. And then chanterelles. I think chanterelles are probably pretty safe once you get used to differentiating the shaggy chanterelle. There are some lookalikes, and you just have to become knowledgeable about the lookalikes. Our spring Verpa bohemica, and it looks just like morel. They grow in the exact same environment, and they come up at the same time. And this one I think tricks you more because people want to see a morel so bad that they collect it and cook it. They don't even think about it. But all you have to do is cut it open, and inside it's kind of cobwebby inside. So there's characters like that you can use to help you differentiate them, and you learn about that. Morels seem to be sort of associated with disturbance. So there's morels that you find in the forest, and there's also a set of morels that really like ravines, riverbanks, and I think it's that flooding action. And so I would say burpas are probably in that same area. Okay, so rules to wild mushroom consumption. Always cook your mushroom. Don't eat them raw. My mycology professor when I was in college said to not even eat the white button mushrooms raw. And I know that's really shocking for a lot of people because a lot of people do. Mushrooms just have some carcinogens in them. They metabolize everything in their environment. Those, are in an environment that they're growing in straw. It's pretty sterile, so you don't have as many things to worry about. But they do have a carcinogen. And it's probably, we also eat burnt meat that also has a carcinogen. So I just tend to always cook every mushroom, even the button mushrooms. Cooking will help denature some of those chemicals that are inside of the fungi, but not all. So just cooking doesn't mean it's going to be safe. So you still want to eat the safe edibles. Another good thing to do is if you've never eaten this mushroom before, just try a few, because these are things that you have never eaten, so you don't really know how your body's going to react. And again, depending where those things are growing, they could be absorbing different things. So it's always a good idea just to try it first and see, do you have any reactions? Because you might be slightly sensitive to it. Another good tip is to always keep a few. Don't eat them all. That way, if something does happen, then you can call. There is actually a fungi toxicity hotline, and my mycology professor is on it, and then he can analyze stomach contents, but that's so much harder than just having the mushroom itself, and then they can tell the medical professionals what kind of reactions they could be seeing based on the fungus. And don't be too greedy. Don't eat too much. That's another good word to the wise. And then get educated. Fungi identification can be kind of daunting, but there are mushroom clubs. There's a lot of good information online. There's some great books. And mushroom shows, that's another great way to learn about fungi. I know in Seattle they have a really big one. We have one in Yakima now. I don't know about up here. People who are really good at identifying fungi will just collect everything that time of year and then display it, and then they'll label it. And so that's a great way to learn about your local fungi flora. They're so important. We've talked about all their ecological functions. They are a fruit when we collect the fungi, but there are things to consider. They are doing a job in the environment. And so I think cutting a mushroom, you're probably not impacting that individual. But over time, some of our actions, especially the way we collect, we can do things to avoid any impacts or reduce our impact. Truffling is incredibly destructive. You have to rake and rake and rake the first couple inches of the soil because that's where all of the truffles are. Some people just go to places they don't have dogs or pigs, so that's another way to reduce your impacts is taking a dog or pig to smell out those truffles. But a lot of people just go to places that they know there are a lot of truffles and they'll just rake acres of ground just to dig them up. And the ground will probably recover, but in the short term, maybe several years, it's going to take a while for all of those hyphae to reconnect. And, like I said, there's just this whole interconnected web underneath the soil that you've just now disturbed. And it's going to take a while for that to recolonize. So some things you can do to reduce that would be to cut versus pick. And some people think I know morel hunters, sometimes they say, just cut the stem and you'll actually get another fruit out of the same stem sometimes, occasionally. And I have seen that. That way you're not really disturbing the fungus itself. You're just cutting one of its apples. You could use a porous bag. There's been a lot of people developing these mushroom collection bags that have holes. And so as you're walking along, you're spreading spores. Another thing would be to try to pick mature fungi. So, sometimes you want to fill your bag, but if you leave some of the immatures, you could even come back. But it's nice because once they're mature, then they're going to release some spores. So you're leaving some of that genetic material there at least. And then we also try to say, don't be too greedy. You collect a bunch and then maybe just leave a few. You can always go to another spot. Mature fungi. In the case of morels, the holes tend to be bigger. With the capped mushrooms, they tend to be flat capped. They're not folded in. There's some fungi like matsutakis. If you guys know about matsutakis, they have incredible market value when they're young and small. And so people will dig underground to get those. I think just they transport easier like that. But I guess mature would be it's open is one of the biggest things. Puffballs, yeah, you just have to kind of poke them. Puffballs are a kind of thing that people are probably going to eat immature. You don't want to eat a mature puffball. There's nothing to eat at that point. And then if you're cleaning your mushroom, it's a good practice just to keep all your trims there. We don't need to spread fungi to other places they're not supposed to be there. That's kind of moving towards the thinking about invasive species. And there's a little of that going on with fungi. We don't know a lot about it, but like Amanita muscaria, there's a whole bunch of fungi that were brought in through plants. So, like I said, there's even in a nursery environment, there's a lot of mycorrhizae, and so those get transferred from place to place. So we have seen a little bit of that happening. There's so many fungi. I mean, they're incredibly diverse, but we don't really understand or know a lot about that diversity and what the function is. We generally understand it. We only know about 5% of the species in the world. That's such a small amount. And even the species that we do know, we're still kind of renaming and trying to figure it out. So there's a lot of stuff we don't know, but we do know that some fungi are very adaptable to being in many places, but we also know that some fungi are really geographically isolated. We've only found them in this one place. I'd say in the Pacific Northwest, there's a lot of that going on with plants. Like, we've kind of given them similar names as a European, and we're finding out that there's some really specific Pacific Northwest plants, fungi, same situation. Like some of the chanterelles, we've been calling them the same chanterelles that we know from Europe, but we're finding out genetically they're totally different. So they're somewhat isolated and different here, and specific to here, so that's important. And some mushrooms, like we've had these kind of like strange springs and falls, especially falls. I think on the east side we get really big fall flushes of mushrooms. But we've had a couple falls that have been incredibly wet. I think there was one, was it last fall, and then maybe like 3 or 4 falls before, and people were saying there was mushrooms that they had not seen fruit for like 50 years. And so that does happen occasionally. There's just mushrooms, they just don't fruit very often. And so it seems like, especially in Eastern Washington, they could be sort of isolated because of that, more easily isolated, from environmental impacts. In Europe, the smaller countries, they've been able to watch their fungi populations, and over time they have seen heavy picking has had some impacts, and they've been seeing some of their even favorite commercially edible fungi declining over time. I have to make my plug for anybody that is a collector of fungi and is really interested in it. Since I work for the Forest Service, I'm actually also on this special fungi work group. And in the Forest Service, we've recognized that fungi are kind of a special group, and they're really specialized. And so we try to have some extra funding set aside for just studies in fungi. And on Forest Service land, we also have recognized lists of rare fungi. And there are international lists, but we're kind of working more towards a local rare species list. So in about 1994, there was one generated for this region, or for the Pacific Northwest region. And around that time, the group that I work for in the Forest Service, we started putting a lot of money towards doing large-scale surveys, which are never enough, just to kind of get an idea if we just weren't seeing some of these rare fungi, or we just weren't looking for them, and answering some questions like that. We've also done some work with taking all of that and then developing kind of habitat descriptions of these species. And there's a bunch of this kind of work that you can see online if you do become interested. And then we've been working with some different people to make habitat models. So we know that these rare fungi really like this kind of tree type and this type of moisture, and overlaying all these characteristics together to try to build habitat models and manage forests better for rare fungi. And if you're really interested in this, some of the really important things to think about when you're out collecting fungi are how you document them. It's kind of challenging because if you are dealing with rare fungi, you have to collect them and really ID them. And a lot of them are really difficult to ID, so it's a bit of a catch-22. But if you do collect them, dry them properly, make a GPS point, and then keep really good notes and information about what you're collecting and where, and kind of descriptions of them at fresh. And just any habitat information is really important, because the habitat information really does kind of help you identify some of these. You can put them in a dryer. The best way is to actually put them in a slow dry, if you can. Cutting them in half, putting them on a screen in the sunlight is very good. I think some of the homemade dryers are old boxes with light bulbs inside of them and just closed off with some air circulation. That's enough heat to you're just trying to keep it from being infected by other fungi, because fungi also are really good at parasitizing other fungi, fungi on fungi. And actually some of the common edibles, like the lobster mushroom, is just a fungi that attacked another fungi, and they sort of contorted and they look like a lobster now. So that's a parasitized fungi. But oven is probably a little too hot. You may not want to go that route, but dryers. Your food dehydrator could also work at a very low setting. We often like to collect like this size. We'll put a ruler in there. Pictures are great as well. Collection labels and that kind of thing. I could talk about fungi forever, but I just wanted to share these few things with you, and I hope you guys enjoyed what I spoke to you about. Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me.
Yeah, you're welcome.
This podcast is produced by Okanogan Highlands Alliance. OHA is located in Tonasket. a town in the heart of the Okanogan Valley of north central Washington. We are inspired by the beauty and diversity of the landscape that surrounds us, from the aspen and conifer forests to the highland lakes to the tumbling creeks that descend to the wide, glacier-carved Okanogan River Valley. We engage in environmental advocacy, habitat restoration, and educational activities in our efforts to protect local ecosystems for future generations. To learn more about OHA or to become a member, please visit our website, okanoganhighlands.org. Thanks to Helen Lau for providing the presentation and to Humanities Washington for supporting Season 2 of the Highland Wonders Podcast. The theme song was written and performed by Tyler Graves and Andy Kingham.
Life is what we make it. It's all that we are. We're all what it is, 'cause we're living with blessed unrest. Blessed unrest. Blessed unrest. Blessed unrest.